Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining our webinar today to talk about the latest BDSA update to the legal cannabis forecast. My name is Kelly Nielsen. I am the Vice President of Insights and Analytics here in BDSA. I'm joined today by Michael Arrington, the lead forecast analyst on our team as well. And so the two of us are going to tag team this presentation. We're going to talk for the next 20 minutes to a half hour or so about the latest updates on our perspective on where the legal cannabis industry is going globally. As we're jumping in, just to provide a little bit of perspective on where the market forecasts fit, quick reminder for those of you who may not currently work with BDSA, that we have a range of core solutions, and our goal is really to provide a complete view of the total global cannabinoid market, both what's going on today and into the future. And so just to provide some perspective on the types of solutions we offer, because our goal is really to help our clients understand what's going on today in order to make decisions and best set themselves up for the future. And first, one of our core solutions is retail sales tracking. So we spend a lot of time and effort working with distributors in the United States and partners in Canada to understand exactly what's selling across key markets. In the United States, we actually cover 11 legal states. And then we cover a range of Canadian provinces. And this is really about understanding what products are selling, what categories, what brands, and at what prices, and how is all of that moving through the legal cannabis market, i.e. dispensaries. We also spend a great deal of time understanding the why behind the what. So retail sales tracking is a fabulous tool to understand how the market is continuing to evolve, what's moving on a month-to-month basis. But consumer insights is a way for us to understand why that's happening, and it's our way to engage with consumers and understand how consumer perceptions, attitudes, behaviors are changing toward the cannabis industry over time. And so this is a survey that we conduct twice annually, and we're actually just about to kick off our next wave of research. But what we're able to do is we're able to provide perspective of what products are consumers claiming to use? How is the penetration of cannabis usage continuing to shift? Why are consumers making the decisions that they're making about products or dispensaries? And what's great is that we actually have currently 8 waves of different consumer insights information, which goes back several years. And the implication of that is that we've been able to track consumer perceptions by state, by market over time, which, as you can probably imagine, over the past 4 years or so, perceptions have changed pretty dramatically. But then what we're really here to talk about today is our market forecasts. Our market forecasts are our forward-looking view of what's going on in the marketplace. And so I'll talk a little bit about methodology, but what we're really doing is we're using what we know about the future, we're taking what we know about how consumer behavior and perceptions are changing, and we're using that to project out what we think is going to happen in the future. Today, we're going to talk at the total global, US, and Canadian level, but just for reference, we do get a lot more granular in that we can get down to the state level. We can also talk, we project out at the category level by state or by province in the US and Canada. So we can provide a lot of detailed information of where we expect the market to be headed. And so throughout this session, we're going to be covering a couple key things. We're first going to talk about the methodology and the way that we get to our market forecast, the range of different information that really feeds into this system. We're going to talk about key updates and takeaways. Then we're going to make sure to cover off on the US, Canadian, and international market forecasts and provide some perspective on how that's where we expect these things to go. And then we're going to close with some resources if you have questions into the future. And so first, just to provide some perspective on the methodology, this is a predictive model. And what that means is that we are gathering as much information as we can about the volume and the way that products are moving today. And so there's kind of different ranges of information that's available out there that we leverage that feeds into the system. The first and the most involved information is actually our retail sales tracking. So we leverage our retail sales tracking in those 11 markets in order to provide this perspective of just where's the market coming from in order to figure out how big it's going. And we have a lot of really in-depth information there. We take into account things like seasonality, how is volume moving month over month, how is category movement changing, etc. But there are places where we don't necessarily have that retail sales tracking information. And so we are gathering any additional information we can that's publicly available. So this might include things like publicly available state information, information published by the government, and those sorts of things. So we're gathering all this state and tax information that we possibly can. But that's not all we're taking into account. We're also taking into account a range of things that through our empirical testing of what's been going on in the marketplace, understanding that different things can also have an impact on the market forecast. These are things like, what is the population? What is the number of patients for medical markets? What does the overall population look like from a demographic perspective, and how does that compare across states? We look at things like, what is the regulatory status, which as we're talking through this information today, that is a really big point, because what we're continuing to see is the status of the market continues to evolve, continues to change. And so that's really going to dramatically impact our overall market projections. Not to give away my overall thesis, but the key really is that there's two things leading, or there's multiple things leading, but a couple key things as it pertains to regulation that are really impacting the size of this industry in the future. The first is that more and more states are coming online or legalizing cannabis for availability. And so that means there's more states, there's more population that have access to legal cannabis. However, there's also the speed at which this is coming to market. And so we're seeing these large medical markets transition into adult use in ways that are faster than we've seen in the past. And so regulation absolutely comes into account. And so as we're going through this, please keep that in mind, that we are pulling all of this information together. In the US and Canada, we're actually forecasting at the state or province level and rolling everything up, because we know that it's important to look at this at a state by state level in order to get the most accurate estimations. I mentioned earlier that we do provide category level information in the US and Canada. And so you can see those categories that we break out here. For example, we're looking at things like dabbable concentrates, vape, flower, pre-roll, shake, trim, light, edibles, topicals, sublinguals, and then anything else that might be available in the marketplace. And so with that in mind, just to give a couple key takeaways before we dive into the numbers here. The first thing I want to call out is, if this is not your first time looking at BDSA volume forecasts, I want to call out that we actually have increased our overall forecast projections, both for what we expect to happen in 2021, as well as what we expect to happen into the future. And there's several things that are really playing into why we feel confident in making these estimations, or these predictions. And this is all at the global level, but it's really being driven by the US market, and particularly the US adult use market, as more states begin to legalize cannabis. Quick reminder, what we are talking about today when we're talking about legal cannabis is anything sold through dispensary. We are not layering in anything, say CBD from general market or the illicit market at in this particular presentation. So when we're thinking about that market, we're thinking about dispensaries. In the United States, there's a handful of key things that are driving this growth. The first is that we continue to see growth from the most mature markets. So when we look at some of those mature markets like California, Colorado, Nevada, the growth, we see that they're continuing to grow this year, even though they've already had product available for several years now. And if we take a look at the first half of 2021, the growth is up double digits versus what we saw in that same time period last year. So those biggest markets and those most established markets are continuing to expand. But we also see that these newly fully legal markets are exceeding expectations in sales in their second and third years. And the states that are really calling attention here are things like Illinois, Massachusetts, Michigan, each of which have contributed more than double the sales in the first half of 2021 than they did in 2020. which we always expect growth in the second year of product availability, but the rate at which they're growing continues to exceed our expectations. And so we wanted to make sure to manage that accordingly. And then with that in mind, that does change the way that we think about some of these other large markets coming online in the future. So as we look toward New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, et cetera. We're also seeing these emergence of these very large medical markets. And so if you look at markets like Florida, Oklahoma, Pennsylvania, Missouri, those are medical only markets right now that continue to expand in size and continue to exceed some of the initial expectations. And so we're seeing those continue to grow, and we have high hopes for those. But with these things in mind, so you know, we've seen this growth in these medical markets. We're seeing the growth in these existing markets and these other new markets. And really that also has an implication on the future, like I mentioned, that we're seeing new patterns emerge that impact how we're thinking about new states coming online, like New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Virginia. But we're also seeing, and I think this is why I really wanted to call out the emergence of these large medical programs, because these large medical programs, when they ultimately may make a switch to adult use and allow for legal adult use cannabis sales, excuse me, it is likely that they will be able to move very quickly from medical only to adult use. Reminder, we think this because Arizona this year was the fastest market to ever move from medical only. So they were able to move very quickly, and we expect that that will be the same as, you know, states like Florida, Oklahoma, or Pennsylvania move toward adult use legalization. So that's what's going on in the U.S., and I'll show you just here in a second on what exactly is what impact that has at the global level. And we'll talk also a little bit more about Canada in a few minutes, because Canada continues to grow, grown about 54% year over year from 2020 to 2021. So we have high expectations for that as we go to the next few years. And we do see some international growth. Right now, smaller portion of the overall sales, as you'll see, currently driven by Mexico and a handful of European markets. But when we look at European markets and Mexico, there has been some delay due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So the moment we've all been waiting for, what you're looking at on this slide is the worldwide cannabis forecast. And so a couple of things to call out here. The first is that we expect 2021 to wrap up with about a $30.6 billion legal cannabis industry worldwide. As I mentioned earlier, that's about a 41% growth over 2020. So really exciting, a lot of growth there. And what you can see is we expect this legal cannabis market to continue to grow for the next several years and reach $62.1 billion by 2026. And just for some perspective, that's a compound annual growth rate of about 15%. And so I mentioned a little bit earlier that, you know, all of this growth, or a majority of this growth, we expect to be coming from some of that US market. And so what you're looking at on this slide is the breakdown across the US, Canadian, and international markets, broken out by adult use versus medical markets. And the couple bars I want to call your attention to, first off, are the black bar in the middle, which represents the US adult use market. And so you can see over time, we expect that to continue to expand from about $14.8 billion in 2021 to $36.3 billion in a few years, or by 2026, excuse me. Meanwhile, that international adult use market and international medical market, those are the orange. And so let's take a look specifically at the US legal market. And so I mentioned here a moment ago that the US market expanding from a total of about $24.9 billion this year to $47.6 billion by 2026. So that's about a 14% compound annual growth rate over the next few years. The other thing I want to call your attention to on this slide is that in 2021, we do expect pretty substantial growth over what we saw last year. So to put that $24.9 billion into perspective, we expect that to be a roughly 38% increase over the 2020 volume, which was closer to about $18 billion. Finally, I want to call out that purple bar. So the purple bar represents the medical market in the United States. And what you'll see is that the growth as we look into the future in the US market is really driven by the expansion of the adult use market. We expect the medical market to reach its peak around 2023, and then actually expect it to start to decline as more and more states legalize, more and more states have product available. Which actually does remind me, I do want to call out and make a quick comment on federal legalization within the US market. All of our forecasts makes the assumption that some degree of federal legalization is likely to happen in the next year or so, but our expectation is that states will still have the opportunity to regulate cannabis at the state level. The implication there is that we do not expect the market to dramatically change in the short term, even with federal legalization, at least from the consumer poll perspective. So let's take a minute to see where we expect this growth to be coming from. So what you are looking at here is the top 10 contributors to growth in the United States over the next 5 years. And a couple things I want to call out. The first is California, which California is a really interesting market because it is currently the biggest global cannabis market in the world and on its own. And we expect it to over double in size over the next couple of years. It continues to expand. It continues to grow in penetration of users in the cannabis space. It continues to add more retailer stores, so more product availability, et cetera. So we expect that market to continue to grow. What's really exciting to me, though, is these next few contributors to growth. So New York and New Jersey. So reminder that those are newly adult use legal states. Product is not yet available. We expect New Jersey product to be available in January 2022, so right around the corner. In New York later that year. And so given some of the patterns that we've seen in other states that recently legalized, like Illinois, Michigan, Massachusetts, we do expect product to be available pretty quickly in New York and New Jersey and other states as they legalize. So really exciting to see those states contributing so much growth. And then we have a couple other big hitters. So as we look at the next set of states here, so Florida, Michigan, Illinois, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and Nevada, all of which are current markets for cannabis in some capacity. So Florida and Pennsylvania being medical only, with Michigan, Illinois, and Massachusetts being fully legal. And again, Michigan, Illinois, and Massachusetts, keep in mind, they're only a couple of years into adult use legalization. Just so to see the growth that we've seen from them is really extraordinary. And we expect that pattern to continue to emerge. And so with Michael?
Sorry, Kelly, your voice faded on me there for a second.
No problem.
All right, well, let's talk about Canada for a second. We're expecting Canada to grow fairly robustly this year, in line with what it has been doing. About 54% in total, to a total of about $4 billion US. If you want to ever do a conversion to Canadian dollars, our forecasts are done in US dollars. You can always look at the Bank of Canada annual averages for historical conversion. And so medical sales are declining. We saw a run up in 2000 as patients increased, but in September, after September of 2020, that stopped, and we saw 15% decline in patients to the end of the year and another 9% in the first quarter of this year. So we're expecting to see patients decline pretty strongly over the course of the year, with medical contracting about 14% to 358 million US dollars. Adult use, though, is growing very strongly, about 67% to 3.6 billion. The bulk of that is being made up by Ontario, and actually, if we look at the next slide, we'll see where the sales are coming from. The Ontario has, as many of you may know if you follow the Canadian market, over the course of 2020, took up an approach of expanding their retail footprint. And we saw a massive expansion of retailers in the second half of 2020 and again in the first part. The province's share of adult use in-store sales has grown from about 24% in June of 2020 to about 37% in June 2021. And I've got a little note here on retailers. If we look at just the total share of dispensaries, we've seen Ontario go from about 324 at the end of December 2020 to 862 at the beginning of this year. That's 538 new stores added, taking share of total dispensaries from about 22% to about 38% in July. If we look back a full year, like in, let's say, May, before this started, we're looking at about 50 dispensaries in Ontario. So we've seen massive growth there and massive growth in adult use sales there. And we would expect to see that continue. So over the next several years, we'll continue to see growth in the 4 big provinces, less so in the smaller ones. These all have a fairly advancing retail, but primarily Ontario, Alberta have the most detailed, most expansive retail footprints. And we'll continue to see growth in BC and Quebec, but a bit more slowly than we do in others. And I think that's about it, Kelly, if you want to come back.
Perfect. Thank you, Michael. So thank you everyone so much for taking some time to talk with us today about the overall growth in the market forecast. As I had mentioned, we have a range of detail around things like by state, by market or by province, by category, in order to provide more color here. So if you have any questions at all, feel free to reach out to either your BDSA representative, excuse me, or feel free to reach out to this email that you have here at info@BDSA or bdsanalytics.com. Really look forward to hearing you. Thank you everyone so much for the time. Have a great day.